With 4 weeks left in session to go, we thought we'd take an opportunity, Karen, you live?
Yep.
All right, to share with audiences that there's about a month of session left, unless something else happens. We'll talk about that. And what we can still do to influence what remains in the first part of the biennium. But before we go and start talking, my name is Manny Mantabagala. I'm one of the moderators for Indivisible Minnesota Legislative Action. There are a number of us here at the table today, and we're happy you could join us. Our special guests today are Senator Susan Kent and Representative Mike Freiberg. And why don't we start a little bit with what district they're from and a little bit about their background.
Susan Kent, and I represent, it's District 53, which is the city of Woodbury, and then the southern parts of Maplewood and Oakdale and Landfall make up my district. I am in my 7th session, so over halfway through my 2nd term, and I'm the assistant DFL leader in the Senate, and I'm on education, transportation, and then in the Senate we call it state government and elections for all kinds of fun with Senator Kiffmeyer. Yes.
Oh, yeah.
So and we, as you all are all too familiar, are in the minority, and so I keep saying we're like the offensive line for the House and the governor.
Mike Freiberg, I'm also in my 7th term, so we got elected the same year. I am the state representative for District 45B, which is all the parts of Crystal, Golden Valley, New Hope, and Robbinsdale. I find myself in the majority now, which is kind of exciting. I haven't been in that since my first term. I'm chairing a committee now too, which is a added layer of responsibility, but it's been exciting. I'm chair of the Government Operations Committee. I also serve on your counterpart, the State Government Finance Committee, the Health and Human Services Policy Committee, a couple subcommittees like the Local Government Subcommittee, Rules, Pensions Committee. I think I'm on 6 or 7. It gets hard to keep track of sometimes. When I'm not in the legislature, I work as a public health attorney, just a block or 2 away from here, and I've done that for about 12 years or so.
Representative, you mentioned when we were talking before the program started that one of the classes you teach at William Mitchell is legislative process.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk to our audience about what it means that we're in the first part of a biennium? What does that mean from a sort of thinking about how bills are going to play out and what the focus is this first of the 2 years?
Sure. Well, you don't need to teach a class at a law school to know that. I'm sure Senator Kent could talk about that just as easily as I could. But generally speaking, in the first year of a biennium, it's the odd year. The main thing we focus on is passing the budget for the state of Minnesota. We have a biennial budget, so it then goes for the 2 years, and it's a longer session. It goes from the beginning of January to the end of May. Next year it'll be shorter, and traditionally the main thing you handle in the second year of the biennium is the bonding bill, but any other issue can come up also, policy issues, policy questions, other priorities of leadership in both chambers. So the budget's the main thing we do this year. We're scheduled to end on May 20th, so we have about a month to go left in the session, and hopefully we will in fact be done by then. If we don't pass the budget, then there's the possibility of a special session as well as potentially of a shutdown, but hopefully we won't get to that this year.
Okay, so we started with a surplus this year, is that correct? Would that be unusual in your experience to be talking about the possibility of a shutdown in a surplus year? Senator?
Well, so it's important to keep in mind, and the analogy I always use is that if you think about your household budget, if you get a raise and you're going to have ongoing higher income every month, you make different decisions than if you just get a nice Christmas bonus, right? You're not going to take on a new mortgage just with the one-time bonus. So our budget surplus, even at the beginning of session, was heavily in the one-time money, not very much in the ongoing. So if we want to put more money towards our schools, that's an ongoing thing. If we want to give a tax cut, that's an ongoing thing. If we want to put more money into care providers, also ongoing. And when the new forecast came out, basically the ongoing money essentially went away. There's a little bit of it right away, but then there's nothing in the out years. And we have to balance our budget for these first 2 years, the first biennium. We also have to look at what the ramifications are for the next biennium. And so you can't go.
Is that what they call the tails?
The tails, yes, that's
Okay.
that's the ramifications of all this stuff we do now as it goes on into the future.
So you don't get to just spend with no thinking about the consequences of your spending or cutting decisions.
Right.
Okay. With that as sort of a baseline, was before session started, was the assumption that there would be status quo with some one-time spends, or what were some of the big kind of questions that needed to be resolved? And maybe let's start with the single largest chunk of the budget, if I'm reading MMB's website correctly, the operating budget. That's Health and Human Services, right? Roughly,
Usually
what
E12.
they say, 40% of the state
Somewhere around there.
spending.
Usually E12.
Yep.
Yeah, E12 is around there too.
Okay. Oh, yeah,
E12's
okay.
next.
Okay, if
Right.
you add up higher ed, yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
So if you start with an assumption that our spending and Health and Human Services are going to be a big chunk of our budget, what were some of the considerations before we even started here having committees here? What were some of the questions that you thought would need to be resolved?
So I would say something that everybody keeps talking about is tax conformity, just because that is a big unfinished thing that was handed to us by the big federal tax bill.
Okay.
And so, for those who've just been through this, Minnesota is in a weird spot because we did not conform our local tax policies to that.
Now we don't have
We
to.
don't have to, exactly, and there are ramifications, but that was a thing that, to a degree, everybody has agreed we should do something about.
Okay.
And there are different ideological approaches of how that should work its way out, but that was a thing that was out there. And that has ramifications in both directions on the budget. The other ones, for example, there had been federal changes that represented a cut in pay to some of our care providers.
Yep.
And that was a thing we had hoped to address.
Yep.
Always making sure that we're keeping up with inflation with our schools. That's another one that stays top of the list. So there are, a number of things that affect the general fund that we knew coming into this year were pretty serious things to look at.
So let me bring up so Triber. One of the things that, speaking of that would affect, like, if you have a pool of money, one of the things that would affect that pool of money going in the future was the fate of the provider tax. Maybe you could tell our audience what the provider tax is and why is it even a question about whether it is going to be around or not.
Yeah, well, it was put into law, I don't know, 25 or 30 years ago, but it had a sunset on it. So it's a tax on medical providers, and it's scheduled to sunset at the end of this biennium. So it's not a problem for the budget that we're setting for this 2-year cycle, but it is definitely, it's going to leave, what is it, 750
Close to $1 billion.
million, close to $1 billion hole going forward. So that was I was going to mention that as one of the, an additional thing that is something that needs to be addressed in this session.
And what does that provider tax pay for? What's it used for? What kind of programs would be at risk if it were to disappear?
Well, it's primarily healthcare programs, so
Okay.
it goes to
In
healthcare access.
Minnesota Care.
Yeah, Minnesota Care.
Okay, so when you say healthcare, that's public health insurance programs, that's public health prevention spending, is like SHIP one of the state health?
Is that over there? Statewide health improvement program.
You're asking a couple of non-HHS
Yeah.
people.
All right, but in short, I don't know, $1 billion feels like a real sizable chunk of revenue
It is.
to lose, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Significant, yeah.
The House started in the opening bid, we're gonna keep it here, yes? And what's the status of where the House's position, and it's shared by the governor. Where's that sort of resetting the sunset? Is it alive? Is it in the HHS omnibus? What are you?
Yeah, I believe it's in the HHS omnibus where, that'll be, we'll be taking that up. We're on break on
Okay.
our Easter break right now, so we'll be taking up the omnibus bills when we get back. I haven't the omnibus bill I'm most familiar with at this point. The only finance committee I serve on this session is the state government finance committee.
Okay.
So that's the one I've been following a little more closely. But yeah, I know it's been a priority of
And-
the House DFLs.
And, yeah, and when we're talking about this issue, because it is a tax that exists.
Yep.
That will go away
Yep.
according to current law. So what's in the House bill would be a repeal of that sunset.
Okay.
And so it would that tax would just continue on.
But it doesn't have impact on this biennium's budget. It's more an impact the next budget cycle. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Okay. Something you said makes me actually remind me sort of a procedural question because some of our folks might not understand. The organization of work in the legislature is done through committees, right?
Mm-hmm.
So is it fair to say that you're relying on your colleagues in other committees to be the subject matter experts in areas? Because realistically, there's no way you guys could know every single topic that is going to come in front of you to vote on. Is that a fair discussion?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I hear legislators say all the time is that their experience is a mile wide and an inch deep. It's just, I mean, when a bill comes to the House, we'll be voting on the agriculture finance bill, and, being from a suburban district, I don't have a lot of agriculture in my district. I've learned a little bit about it, but, just trying to recognize my limitations in that area. So there are several, and the Senate and the House organize themselves differently, so, but both generally have a, Health and Human Services Finance Committee that creates a Health and Human Services Finance Omnibus Bill that's, I think you said something like 40% of the budget. There's a E12 Education Finance Bill that's another 40%. In the House, we have a Higher Education Finance Committee that'll come out with an omnibus bill, Transportation Finance Omnibus Bill, State Government Finance Omnibus Bill, which is a lot of the miscellaneous agencies, and as well as the legislature and the constitutional offices. So yeah, we're, depending on which committee you serve, you do tend to generate expertise in those areas.
Before we pivot to other issues, I want to ask one more question about HHS Omnibus. The governor campaigned on and proposed as part of his budget a proposal to let people buy into Minnesota Care. Is that part of the HHS House Omnibus right now?
Yes, he's calling it the One Care proposal. So it's not exactly a full Minnesota Care buy-in, but it will provide health care to a lot of people who don't have it.
And Senator Kent, what's the status of the One Care proposal in the Senate?
Can't even get a hearing.
All right.
You're going to hear a lot of that.
All right. Can I get a hearing? And
I don't know if you heard, we had, it's called the Committee on Banned Bills a couple of weeks ago. Which was actually amazing. We went through that thinking, we're going to get some attention on some of these issues and it'll be a good exercise. It actually was so powerful because we did the provider tax and Minnesota Care. We did ERA. I have paid family and medical leave. So that's my bill. I carried that one. We did Senator Torres Ray's bill to increase teachers of color in our schools, and then one of the I think it was the extreme risk protective orders, the red flag bill. And it was amazing to have all the stakeholders there, because they were invested in this conversation, to hear all these things and just realize it's like, wow, if the DFL were to take the majority in the Senate, we could really get some cool stuff done. So.
Okay, I'm gonna hold the question I'm gonna ask about that. Next two topics, you guys pick which one you want. You want to do transportation first, or you want to do education? Let's do transportation. This is just my perspective, and you guys can chime in. It seems like a pretty key, pivotal part of the discussion around transportation is whether or not there's going to be additional new revenue. Is that a fair conversation? Whether it's the 20-cent gallon gas tax the governor proposed or something different, there's going to be a need. Well, let's back up. Is there a need for more revenue? What do you guys think?
So I have served on transportation since I was elected, and I have supported new revenue in a comprehensive, sustainable way to finance not just our roads and bridges, which is hugely important, but also transit. And so
Wait a
it
minute,
is-
you're from the suburbs. Why do they care about transit in the suburbs?
we care about transit in a very big way in the suburbs, and we can't get enough of it.
Okay.
There has been wide agreement that we need 600 million a year for 10 years, which is $6 billion. This is
Okay.
just math to bring things up to where they should be.
That's the fixed, deferred
It's
maintenance.
it's a
that's new
lot of that's
construction,
maintenance and
it's-
public safety. It is
Okay.
it is not a massive expansion of the system.
Okay.
We can fix a few interchanges, but that is not that is not like, ooh, wow, this sets us up for the 22nd century at all. This is
Okay.
it is a pretty meat and potatoes kind of budget, and you can't find that in couch cushions. You know what I mean? It's like you just can't scrounge. I mean, people love to talk about waste and abuse, and we got all this money in the general fund, and we can take sales tax from auto parts, which we took some of that. By the way, have we heard that we're really having problems now in terms of that so-called surplus? We don't have it anymore, and part of that is because we took that money out of the general fund and moved it into roads and bridges. And one of the ways, if I can back up for just a second, that I think is helpful to think about transportation funding, generations ago, Minnesotans, through the constitutional amendment process, set up a separate checkbook for transportation and infrastructure. So we have the general fund that funds HHS and education and higher ed and our courts and the judiciary and all that good stuff. And then you have transportation. And for all those people who say we need to be efficient in spending for transportation and we need to plan well and use those funds wisely, you need that reliable revenue that you know is coming, because these are multi-year projects, right? You don't just wake up tomorrow and say, I'm going to rebuild this major interchange, and it crosses biennia, et cetera. So, and we have the dedicated, constitutionally dedicated gas tax, and let's just all remember, the gas tax goes 100% to roads and bridges, contrary to some things people might try to convince you of, as do some of the other sources. And so keeping that clean, to me, has always made a lot of sense. It's good for transportation, but it also avoids making cuts to these other things that are very important to us as well. And if we want to have conversations about where should this be set, higher, lower, whatever, we can have that conversation, and same thing over here. But keeping those clean, I think Minnesotans decided wisely generations ago to do that. And so now, that's the question. Are we going to be serious about again, this is math, $6 billion over 10 years, or are we going to try to fudge this? And I will point out that we can talk some more about the Senate Republican budget, but they're not putting any new money into transportation, none, not from the general fund, none. They have a really low target on E12, 0.5% and 0.5%, to get into the weeds.
So back up.
But that'll be cuts in education. So all this stuff about we don't need more money to fix our roads, their current budget does nothing to fix our roads, never mind do anything for transit, and it leaves education and health and human services in a world of hurt. So.
All right, so a quick digression. You just used the phrase targets. So when the House and the Senate issue their budget, committee chairs get a number that the leadership wants them to get to. And sometimes the number reads 0, but that doesn't mean they don't want any spending. They just don't want any new spending. Is that correct? Okay. You said that the target that the Senate E12 budget, well, when we come back to education, we'll get there. You talked about its dedicated funding. One of the questions that I think some people are asking is, so I just read, was Denmark or Finland sold more battery-powered cars this year than they did gas cars. What happens in an environment where more and more cars are electrified? Do we need to start thinking about, because unless they all become hovercraft, we're still going to need roads, right? How do we fund roads when we're buying less gas? Is that even a dialogue that's occurring either in the House or the Senate, or is that one of those things where it will have to be kicked down down the road a little bit? I mean, like, how would you crystal ball this thing?
I mean, cars are becoming more efficient, so you know, the gas tax maybe isn't able to go as far as it once did. You know, and that is a conversation I think we need to have down the road. I do think there is an immediate need though for funding. I mean, if you've just driven around St. Paul right here to see the condition of the roads, you probably understand that. But so I do think, you know, that the gas tax is a mechanism we have in place. It's in the state constitution. It's constitutionally dedicated. So, you know, I think that is a solution that will get us through a while. Maybe at some point down the road we might need to look at some sort of mileage tax or something that reflects the fact that, you know, people drive cars of different fuel efficiencies, but they all use the roads to the same amount. So I don't know that we're quite there in having a perfect mechanism in place yet, but I think it is something.
And this is something that is being discussed. It's been discussed in Minnesota. MnDOT has done some studies on this. My colleague, Senator Melissa Franzen, has offered a bill that would create a pilot program to keep studying it. That didn't go very far in the Senate. And in fact, in the Senate, what they're trying to do, and just to back up 2 seconds, so electric vehicles currently, they pay more in terms of sales tax and those fees because they're more expensive cars than their traditional counterparts. And they pay a surcharge, right? So they're already paying. And the argument is that you get into a math discussion, are they paying their fair share or not? And that's a fair conversation to have. But, you know, Republicans in the Senate Transportation Committee are trying to put exorbitant fees on electric vehicles, which to me, first of all, the
But
math
it's a fee, it's not a tax, right?
It's, right. Yes, exactly. And so, but the point is, we do need to think ahead in that way, because that is the future, and that is, you know, much more where we're headed.
So-
But for now, Mike's exactly right. We've got to take care of the roads we've got right now with the system we have, and we need to be planning and be smart about where this is going.
So what I'm hearing from you, I think, is that there appears to be consensus on how much money needs to be raised to take care of our transportation needs. But to the extent that there's going to be an end of session debate, it will be how you pay for it, right?
Right.
And one of the things the Senate Republicans in the Senate, the Republican House did when they had a majority is they diverted sales tax for car parks from general revenue to help pay for transportation needs. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then in the House budget, they would reallocate that funding stream back to general fund and then increase the gas tax in order to sort of pick up the gap. Is that a fair way to
Yeah.
think about this? Okay. Now, in some conversations on the floor in committee, some House representatives have sort of hinted that maybe 10 cents might be something that they could live with. Have you felt any? Is that a realistic thought that might be a way to get to peace in the valley and a deal and all those kind of fun things?
I can't say what it'll take to get to a deal or something, but they are pretty far apart right now. So, it's going to have to come together somehow, and whether it's just lowering the gas tax number, I mean, I can't predict at this point how the session will. I don't have a crystal ball to predict the end of the session, unfortunately.
What about your colleagues?
And it will be, you know, the conversation of a lot of issues, you know. So,
Yeah.
you know, a lot of people's sacred cows will be put up for auction in this discussion, not just in transportation, right? So it's like, okay, you'll get what you want over here on transportation, we'll meet you halfway over here, but you're gonna have to meet us halfway over there.
Now, the context of that is the governor, the speaker, and the majority leader all agreed to come up with joint agreed targets by May 6th. Do you have any sense that that date is at risk? Because that's just a promise. There is nothing binding upon any of them.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
What are you guys hearing or
Yeah,
sensing?
this is a new, it's a new calendar we're working with. I mean, so traditionally there've only been 3 deadlines. They put new ones in place where they have to come out with joint targets. After the third deadline is traditionally when the finance bills have to pass both the House and the Senate. And then work together in a conference committee or not, depending on how it's going. But then you just kind of wait till the end of traditionally we would just kind of wait till the end of session to see what happens. This year there are additional timelines where they have to, come out with targets, come out with a conference committee report, and then have those acted on by both chambers. So we haven't had these sorts of deadlines before. So, but at least since I've been there, I've been in every combination possible. I've been in both House and Senate. I suppose you have as well, both House and Senate DFL. My second term, I was in the minority, so the House was Republican, but the Senate was still DFL. My third term, both were Republican. This time, it's kind of a flip of my fourth term. So it's kind of hard to predict. It's
Right.
kind of hard to predict anything, especially with the new deadlines. But hopefully, we'll be working on the budget bills right when we get back next week, and I'm sure the Senate will be as well. And
So here's a little trivia on the deadlines, which I think is sort of interesting, and for whatever this does in helping read tea leaves.
All right.
So we used to have the Purple Caucus in the Senate, and the idea was, what can we agree on?
That was you, Jeremy Miller,
Roger Reiner, Greg Clausen, a pretty big group. And Carla Nelson was one of them, which is worth pointing out. She was a very strong advocate of what we called the fourth deadline, which was to have all those conference committee reports done a week before the end of session. And frankly, because there was never any counterpart in the House, it doesn't really work to have one body saying we're going to have these deadlines if the
Sure.
other one's not going to do it.
Sure.
So it never really went anywhere. But I think it's interesting that they really have held hands and committed to doing this in a bipartisan way. And so the question is going to be, it's going to come to be a rock and a hard place, right? And then who's feeling which is harder than the other.
What's the current gap between the House position and the Senate? It's about $2 billion.
sounds right.
Okay, that feels like a gas tax and a provider. No, the provider tax won't help.
Don't forget taxes.
Oh,
Taxes are
Yeah,
a
yeah,
big
yeah.
part of this conversation.
All right, two more topics before we do sort of open from the floor. Let's switch to education. Let's start with sort of the House wanted to do additional spending on top of sort of status quo, right?
Mhm.
Because status quo, from the House's perspective, had to include, I'm trying to sort of understand this, had to include, the fact that, I don't know, heating might cost more, or like there's this thing called inflation, right? So just to maintain meant more money. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, and I mean the School Boards Association came in early on, and the Association of Metropolitan School Districts saying, the way education gets talked, K-12 education gets talked about is through the general education formula. You put more money on the formula. Each school is allocated a certain amount of funding based on the number of students they have. So the school boards, to keep pace with inflation, said they would need about 3% each year, and the House budget does generally do that. So, because inflation and teachers' salaries, they work harder than anybody, and the cost of heating, the cost of air conditioning, whatever you're talking, transportation costs, fuel costs for the buses. I mean, yeah, it adds up, and just a zero target isn't, might be viewed as not a cut, but if you add in inflation, it really essentially is.
So if I tell you to spend the exact same money you did last year, but costs have gone up 3%, it's a functional cut.
Yes.
And so AMSD, which is all the metro area school districts, they did a survey of their member districts, and their worst case scenario they thought would be a 1% increase each year of the biennium, and so that'd be described as 1 and 1. And so two of my school districts, South Washington County and Stillwater area school districts, each would be looking at $5 million shortfalls with a 1% increase. So what has the Senate got in their budget proposal? Everybody in your coffee? Half and half. 0.5% and 0.5%.
Oh, it's an increase. Except it's not really.
Well, but what's interesting is, and that's what's, it'd be amusing if it weren't so sad. The chairs in the Senate are all very frustrated with their targets, because they know we need to be doing better. And I mean, they're taking a lot of heat because they know they're going to have to go home and deal with school districts making cuts. And the thing in education that happens, either the districts make the cuts, or they go back out to local property taxpayers with a referendum and say, will you give us more money in your local property taxes so that we don't have to make these cuts because the state didn't do their share?
In some of the podcasts on Call the Senate or on the Values podcast, some of the conversation around E12 has been sort of part of what's driving this dynamic is our very unreliable partner in the federal government, particularly when it comes to special ed. Can you guys talk a little bit about that? Like, why is that material in our conversation thinking about E12 funding?
Yeah, well, the federal government promised it would fund a certain portion of the special education costs and has never.
40%.
Yeah, 40% has never done so. So, you know, and I don't. So I don't think as the state we can depend on the federal government. I think, you know, special children who receive special education services, one of the, you know, which includes one of my children, you know, deserve to have as strong of an education as anybody. So I think, you know, I think the state needs to step up, and I don't think we can count on the federal government because they haven't lived up to this promise.
And that shortfall between, so what the feds mandate and what the state mandates in terms of the services that are provided, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then not paying for those requirements. So then the school district it's an unfunded mandate. It's a classic unfunded mandate. The districts have to make up the difference. And that is pushing 12 or more % of the local district's budgets in some districts.
Okay.
So it's significant that they're having to, so that is money then that has to come from someplace, right? So, yeah.
And part of that I think, at least for me, is somewhat alarming, is that part of the implicit assumption or foundation in Minnesota Miracle was that no matter where you lived in Minnesota, we were going to figure out a way to make sure you got a quality education. Do you worry that that consensus is at risk or is eroding? I mean, what do you guys have observed in sort of your time in public service?
I think the commitment is there if you talk to people about it. You know, I think people believe strongly, you know, talk about the Minnesota Values Project. First and foremost, I think people believe we need to take care of all our kids and make sure they all have a good, strong start in life. But I think people do not appreciate how far away we've gotten from that. And, you know, just literally in my neighborhood, two other school districts, so South Washington County, but then North St. Paul, Maplewood, Oakdale, 622. 622's had a really hard time passing their referendums. And, but South Wash has been able to.
Mm-hmm.
And so literally houses away in my neighborhood, it's a very different situation in terms of the kinds of services that those students receive when they go to school, in terms of the media center, the arts and the enrichment classes, the different kinds of things, the class sizes is a huge part of that. So we, you know, like I say, in my neighborhood, it's not even zip code, it's what block you live in, you know.
Mm.
So you know,
Yeah.
people do not see how much that really is affecting our districts now.
Yeah, and it shouldn't come down, you know, education, you know, there was the Minnesota Miracle, there's also, it's a guaranteed right in the state constitution.
Yes.
It says there should be a uniform system of education.
Uniform.
So, I mean, when you have school districts that aren't able to pass referenda, you know, you're putting those children at a disadvantage to students who are fortunate enough to live in areas where they are. So I just feel like the whole system of depending on referenda is flawed. And, you know, I've introduced a bill this year to allow school districts to renew operating referenda, you know, by a vote of the school board rather than having to go to a referendum. I mean, city councils are able to do that, the county boards are able to do that. Our school boards are elected officials as well. I think they should be given the same level of trust that our other local office holders have.
And that is a partisan issue of contention, unfortunately.
You mean the ability for a elected representative to? Okay, all right.
That's right.
And it's in
And
the,
just
and it
to
made it
renew
into
it.
the House Education Bill too.
Yeah.
And this is
Oh.
just to renew operating, so not like technology levies, but operating referendum that enables them to pay their teachers that are not an increase, so just at the same level. We went through that in the Robbinsdale School District in 2007. They put a referendum out there, and they brought in, the opponents brought in this guy from Iowa, whose job is, he's like the referendum buster, and he was very successful in sowing division within our community. And the referendum failed, and you know the school district had to make cuts, and it was very traumatic for a lot of people, and some people left and open enrolled their kids into other districts because they were worried about it. So we've kind of rebounded since then and have been able to pass a few, but that was a very challenging time where I live.
And those referendums, when they come up for renewal, it's very time intensive and expensive for people involved to have to deal with that and to have to, the school district has to work through that process. So it takes resources in the district to just manage those elections. And they pass over 95% of the time. So, it doesn't make sense not to.
All right. You brought up the topic, switching topics again, taxes. So we started with sort of, we don't have to do conformity, right? We're one of roughly 15 states that conform our taxes to the federal standard. What would happen if we didn't do conformity? What impact would it have on Minnesotans, sort of high level?
High level, if we don't do it, there will be it will keep taxes higher for some Minnesotans.
Okay.
And, the concern that I have is that we want to make sure, because we know that the federal tax bill that we're trying to conform to disproportionately benefited the very wealthy.
Yeah.
And put more of a burden on middle-class families. So we want to make sure that we don't, we have the opportunity to offset some of that, and we certainly don't want to exacerbate that.
All right. And then in the House, my understanding is, again, high level, the concept of the House majority is to take care of some of that middle income tax relief, and at the same time recapturing some of sort of the overseas revenues that corporations have been sort of sheltered from Minnesota taxes. Is that a fair summary of where the House is?
Yeah, no, that's a good summary.
Okay. I'm guessing the Senate majority ain't there, right? That's not a place they would, I guess, I haven't looked at their proposal very closely, but I would anticipate there may be some cuts in there.
Well, what's interesting is they have a zero target in the Senate.
For taxes.
Right, so, and to your point, it's not that they're not gonna do anything. It's that, they will do some conformity, and then they will also do some tax cuts and other things so that it balances out in the end.
And that's why I think you guys were talking about when in order to get to the May 6th targets for each specific bucket, you almost need a kind of a global understanding or agreement on sort of how everything's gonna look.
Yeah, we're unlike the federal government. We're constitutionally required to balance the state budget. So if you're spending more than the base in one area, it would need either a tax increase or a revenue increase or a cut somewhere else. So yeah, it's kind of up to leadership and in the House, the Ways and Means Committee to come up with those targets.
All right. Let me switch to your area of expertise, which is government operations. Yep. Whole bunch of things are sort of in your bucket. One of which is the Equal Rights Amendment, right?
Well, yeah. Any amendment to the Minnesota Constitution has to go through the government. So it starts in the Government Operations Committee. So I think the Equal Rights Amendment has a cost too. So it went to the State Government Finance Committee. It may have gone to one. Can't remember if it went to another one or not. I don't think it did. But it was, I was a new chair in January. I've never chaired a committee before, but I knew that was something a lot of constituents of mine, a lot of Minnesotans were interested in. It hadn't had a hearing in the House since the early 1970s when the original federal Equal Rights Amendment was under discussion. So I just decided okay, we should probably give this a hearing. And it was. We did. It passed through there. It passed through the State Government Finance Committee. It passed on the floor in the House. It just adds. And I should mention there are actually two bills. We heard them on the same day. One is adds an amendment to the state constitution saying, saying you can't discriminate on the basis of gender. But then there's another one. There is still the whole discussion about the federal Equal Rights Amendment too. So one was Representative Moran had a bill that was. Just calling on Congress to repeal the time limit on the federal Equal Rights Amendment too, because they only need one or two more states.
Well, you make it sound non-controversial, and this is a common sense thing. And I have to admit that I was naive enough to think before session, oh, this is a slam dunk, right? Who would be against?
Well,
So,
and then in the Senate.
It was controversial. I mean, I could talk with some of the
Well,
yeah, so
yes.
I do want to talk about what happened in the House, but the Senate.
what's interesting in the Senate is, and Sandy Pappas has carried it for years, and so she had the bill again this time, and she had, I think, 3 Republican, you have 5 co-authors
She had co-sponsors,
in
yes.
the Senate.
Yep.
And so I think 3 of them are Republicans, but then after pressure from some of the pro-life groups, because they are intentionally conflating equal rights with abortion rights, reproductive rights, which is not connected, and you can talk about it because you had the hearings and got to sit through it. They pulled their names off the bill.
Wow. All right. And I'm guessing the same dynamic happened in the House?
Yes, yeah. So there was a lot of, when we heard it on the House floor, I don't believe they ended up offering amendments in the Government Operations Committee, but on the House floor they offered amendments to say, this would not create any new rights related to abortion or something along that line. They also had a lot of, they expressed a lot of concern over the use of the word gender instead of the word sex.
Yeah, so that felt like an anti-trans thing. Is that too simplistic? Or is that
No, no. If you heard some of the debate on the House floor, it was simplistic is probably a good way to describe it.
All right. So is that an issue that needs to be resolved this year, or is it the kind of thing that can happen in year 2 of the biennium? In other words,
yeah.
you guys passed it out of the House, so it's sitting in the Senate, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they could start next year with a new committee cycle.
Any bill is alive throughout the whole biennium, so it could come back next year. I think since this is a constitutional amendment that would get voted on by Minnesota voters, there is a date next year by which it would need to be passed. I think it's in March. I could be wrong about that.
In
exactly.
order to be on
Just
the
to-
November ballot?
Yes, in order to be on the ballot for the 2020 election. We could also pass it later and have it be on the 2021 or 2022 ballot. So
Okay.
you can set it further out if you need to.
Are there any bills that if they don't make it this year, they're pretty much dead because there's no chance of? Is it fair to say that any bill requiring spending is pretty much, if you can't get it done in this cycle, they're realistically, understanding weird things happen, but like realistically, is that kind of a way to think about this?
There could end up being sometimes in the second year there's a supplemental budget bill that we had this omnibus
Based on
prime
the
bill
forecast
last year
or-
that was basically
okay.
a supplemental budget bill that if it turns out the forecast shows another surplus, then that could happen. Or if something is viewed as important enough to be funded, then as long as there's some way to offset it either through a revenue increase or a cut somewhere else, then that it could still happen that way.
All right. Another topic that I think is in your purview is the Help America Vote Act. Spend money. So if I understand this correctly, it's a pot of federal money that in order for us to use, we simply have to authorize the Secretary of State to go ahead and get the money. And it's about $6 million.
6.5.
6.5. And there was a little like nugget in the redacted Mueller report today that mentioned that we were one of 4 states the Russians were targeting in the 2016 election. Surely we must be just falling over ourselves to get this money, right?
Well, not every state requires legislative authorization to access these funds. Some states just received it automatically. Other states decided, hey, election security sounds good. Maybe we should pass a law to do that. So we're the only state at this point.
How many states, Mike?
That would be 49 states have done that, and 1 state has not. So, for whatever reason, it's frustrating because before the session started, Speaker Hortman and Majority Leader Gazelka said, okay, there are a few things we should be able to pass early on, and they mentioned this as one example of something. And then they started, the devil's always in the details, so it's okay, well, we passed this in the Omnibus Prime bill, but at that point it was only 1.6 million because that's what the Secretary of State had come up with a plan on how to spend it. So the Senate Republicans have been saying, okay, we'll only allow it to be that much. You know, the Secretary of State has since come out with a plan on how to spend the full $6.5 million. So to me, it certainly makes sense that we should do that. I mean, I personally, after this whole experience, I feel like we should just get rid of the requirement for legislative authorization altogether, because the legislature has shown itself as not capable of making grown-up decisions on this. So I just think the funding should just come to the Secretary of State automatically.
So God forbid it's being leveraged for other purposes, but
Which is, so, and just to take it back a little bit,
Yeah.
last year, so this money was available in the spring of 2018, and when we were doing the Omnibus Prime thing, it was in there. And actually, my House colleague at the time, Kelly Fenton, a Republican, carried it in the House and carried it separately, and it passed out of the House separately for the amount that they were asking for at the time, the 1.6 million. We could not get Chair Kiffmeyer to pull it out and run it separately in the Senate, so that's how it got stuck in the.
So this is not a leadership thing. This is a Chair Kiffmeyer.
Yep, that is exactly right.
All right.
And so that money could have been used to help us with the 2018 elections, but it sat in them, and actually it's here. That money is actually in an account of MNB. We just can't access it, but that's a little trivia. So now, Secretary of State Simon has done an amazing job. He's held all these working groups and done all this analysis of and he's worked with some of the federal cybersecurity and election security officials to identify what is it we should be doing to strengthen Minnesota's election system. There's an entire, very detailed plan to spend that $6.5 million, and we just keep hearing, no, it's premature, it's too soon, and we've got the primary in March next year. And we need to get going on this, because you don't just flip a switch and fix this stuff. This is stuff that takes time to implement, to source and to implement. And you said it exactly right. Because I keep asking why. There's video of me on the floor. Why? The only thing that we can come up with is that it's being used as a bargaining chip for these end of session negotiations.
And it's in conference right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not in the House.
The conference committee needs to meet.
The Senate conferees would need to attend.
All right, so for those of you who don't know, so they've had 3 meetings, of which only one, the Senate conferees, even bothered showing up. Kind of hard to negotiate at an empty table, basically.
Yeah.
And that may happen again Tuesday.
Are they calling?
Who's got the gavel this time?
I'm not sure. Yeah, the gavel alternates between
It's the
the House and the
It's the
Senate.
House has it.
Okay.
All right.
So yeah, Representative Mike Nelson is the head of the conference committee there, so he's chair of the State Government Finance Committee. I'm not sure if he's planning on calling it immediately when he returns, but I know he's more than willing to meet. So.
All right. So those are the sort of prepared questions I had for you guys. Let's turn this now over to sort of the table. What questions did we not talk about you guys would like to get some?
I have a question. So we talked a little bit about the gas tax and the importance of having dedicated revenue for transportation, but can you talk a bit about why that's so important to all the other budget items in Minnesota, healthcare, education, and everything else?
So when we took the sales tax for auto parts out of the general fund and spent it on roads and bridges, that was some of that ongoing money that now we no longer have access to deal with inflationary increases in education.
That's about 300 million.
About 300 million a year,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
Mhm. So when you think about the problem being 600 million for 10 years, that's half the problem, right? But we did that by pulling out a significant amount of money
That would have been
that would have gone
used
to
for-
education
For
and
education,
HHS and
HHS.
right,
yeah.
exactly.
So we've been shortchanging everything else to sort of patch roads.
And so that we don't deal, in my opinion, honestly with, we have this user fee based approach. Like I said, it was approved by Minnesota voters repeatedly over generations.
Yeah, and when it's set at a certain level, obviously it doesn't increase with
Right.
inflation too. If you had it as a percentage or something, then it might. But so you need to reauthorize it every time, just to it doesn't. The gas tax doesn't do what it did 20 years ago.
So, and when we last raised the gas tax in Minnesota in 2008 after the bridge fell down, that number so not only has it lost buying power in terms of its effect on the roads, its impact on our pocketbook is now gone. Do you know what I mean? So it's the same inflationary effect on our buying power. Also, you know, so it's like we could, you know, we at least just renew what we did in 2008.
So the tax on the on the parts and service, all that did was move it to be dedicated?
Yes, but it's not constitutionally dedicated,
Yeah.
it was statutorily dedicated, but
So
yes.
it would be fair to call it a raid.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
Was there a proposal to increase that tax by Republicans? Or?
So the, no, is the short answer.
Okay.
Because what they did last time was they took just a portion of that
Okay.
category of sales tax revenue. And that didn't affect, I mean, you know, all of
Yeah.
us buying auto parts, that hasn't changed what we're spending, it just changes where it goes. And so they could have taken the rest of it. So now we've got part of that going to roads and bridges, but not all of it. But they basically, their bill, the Senate Republicans' transportation bill, is what we call a lights on bill. It does nothing for our transportation infrastructure.
It is some of the, and perhaps I'm reading too much of it, it feels like a lot of what the Senate Republicans are doing is sort of kicking the can down the road because they're figuring they're going to have a stronger bargaining position post 2020. I mean, is that a simplistic way of thinking about this?
Well,
I would hope they won't. I would hope they won't be in the majority.
and I would
so.
say that the scuttlebutt is that they actually recognize that they're going to have less of a bargaining position in 2020. So they're trying to leverage as much as they can now.
And then, I mean, you know, assuming they lose the majority too in the next election, then it falls on the Democrats, you know, the Democrats that are in the majority to fix all these problems and make some
okay.
difficult decisions too regarding
So
revenue.
And what they've done with taxes over the years and the spending over the years, we are looking at deficits, you know. So and the economic outlook, contrary to what some people might say, is not as robust as it would be. So yeah, I mean, you know, we're looking at some tough decisions in the coming years.
Gotcha. So it might be kicking the can to fix the problem to somebody else.
Right.
Well, the gas tax though is a good cultural and like metro outstate wedge for Republicans too. So and it does really have a I live in SD32, and so I mean it does have an impact there, and it plays into this narrative of kind of rural and exurban community versus urban community.
Well, and transit too. They love to campaign against, you know, just use lots of rhetoric against transit, whether it's light rail or buses. Even though, I mean, Greater Minnesota, particularly in the regional centers, has their own transit systems as well.
Good ones.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, but I mean, there does seem like there is a real greater impact on communities outside the metro area for when you're doing a gas tax. Just the distances people travel and the age of vehicles.
But
and
I will say the flip side of that is that, yes, I mean, that is true. That you tend to travel longer distances, so therefore you would pay more in gas tax. That said, the math is that metro purchases and gas tax revenue is higher, it goes to more, it's disproportionately spent in Greater Minnesota. It's collected more here, it's spent more in Greater Minnesota. And so this is where, you know, one Minnesota, you know what I mean?
Right.
It's like we just all need to work together and take care of our infrastructure. And we can, and again, we need to have the conversations. You know, is it gas tax? Is it motor vehicle sales tax? Is it registration and tabs? You know, some people talk about the gas tax being regressive, which all things being equal it is. But that also is, you know, a few dollars a week as opposed to, you know, your registration and tabs, which is one check all of a sudden, that for a lot of working families is hard to come up with that in that moment. You know?
Yeah.
So
that's where like the wheelage tax, right, comes in.
right.
What's I just don't know what's going on with the taxes on like ag diesel and like commercial diesel. Is that part of the when we say gasoline tax? Is that part of it? Or is that
If
separate?
if it's ag vehicles, yes,
Yeah.
unless I think there are some exceptions.
Yeah, there are a lot of exceptions.
Yeah, there are
Right.
exceptions.
Like-
You know, where depending on where you get it and
Yeah.
use it, and then you know even things and some of these, like, snowmobile gas, there's a chunk that goes to the DNR to maintain snowmobile trails, you know.
Yep.
So we try to be sensitive to the different dynamics.
Well, I know a lot of an over-the-road truck does 7 times the wear and tear on the roadway than
Yeah.
cars.
Right.
But
Yeah, and that's a huge issue, the
Yeah.
big trucks on some of those very little rural roads that, you know, and that's we did a transportation tour a few years ago, and we went to agricultural communities in southern Minnesota, and the county engineer there said that the budget used to be able to do 8 miles a year of real road reconstruction, and now it does 8 miles a year of mill overlay, just,
Yeah.
and that's not a good sign, because that's an expensive Band-Aid.
Yeah.
You know, if all we're doing is Band-Aiding asphalt, that's a very expensive way to not actually fix the roads.
Yeah. Well, I live in Schleswig County and the township, so I mean,
Oh, and the townships have such a challenge, and
Yeah,
that's
it's
another thing we
really-
need to address.
yeah, it's really hard. So I mean, maybe
Yeah.
you could talk about that kind of funding.
See, and this is the conversation that I keep having, way in the transportation funding weeds, but there's this thing called corridors of commerce, and then we get into the thing about like the metro transit funding versus the suburban opt-outs transit. So you get all these people trying to rob Peter to pay Paul. And it's these, you know, we're all fighting over scraps because there's just not enough resources to take care of our system. You know, the facts about this is Minnesota is I get these numbers wrong, like the 21st-ish number rank in the population, so in terms of taxpayers, right? And we're close to 15 in terms of land area, right? So you've got relatively fewer people paying for more land area. We have the 5th largest road system in the country in terms of road miles, being supported by the 21st largest group of people.
Oh.
You know, and so we've got to have some serious conversations. Do we seriously want to maintain that or not? I mean, you know, then we need to be honest and say a lot of these roads need to go back to gravel, and we can't do the kind of public safety things that we need to do. But we need to be, that's my point, we need to be honest about it. You know, we can't just pretend that you can magically do this with bonding, because we can't afford to do that.
Yeah, well, I mean, and that's actually already a trend, right? Where like counties are giving back roads to towns and townships and
Right.
states.
Because they can't afford to maintain them. And again, just like in education, all of these things, if your roads, like I live real close to a big county road in Washington County, if that road starts having problems, people are picking up their phone and they are calling the city, they are calling the county, they want that fixed tomorrow, right? Well, same thing that we've done, and this is true also, this is your point about education and federal funding, same thing. I was 19 years old, and I'm old now, the last time we raised the gas tax in the United States. Okay? 1993, do the math. And all that money trickles down to the states as well. So that hose is being clamped shut. And then we're doing the same thing at the state level, and it really affects our cities and our counties and our townships, and that again comes back to local property taxes.
So a lot of us are feeling that we'd have really nice things if it weren't for the Senate, not personal. And so
A lot of people in the Senate feel the same way.
things like freedom to drive and restore the vote and common sense gun bills. Do you see any hope for anything? And is there anything we can do as a mass constituency to
So-
push the Senate a bit?
Okay, before I get to that part of the answer to the question, I do want to point out that the Senate, when we were in DFL majority, we passed a comprehensive sustainable transportation package a few times. We passed driver's licenses for all. We passed, I think we had restore the vote at the time, but we were working on it. There were a number of payday lending, there were a number of things that the Senate did. So we have it in us to do it. In terms of what we can do now, I mean, you know, you guys are amazing, and it just stay organized and keep up the pressure. And I would say, you know, sometimes it's a matter of staying focused on. I think there are issues where they really feel the pressure, and they're pretty easy to identify. The election funding that one is mystifying even to some of the Republican members, you know. They realize that's a bad look because they realize it's clearly just a political game that is being played with our election security, and that everybody understands that that's not okay. And if we can have conversations about cuts to education because of unrealistic budgets, people understand that. Same thing with the Senate is making cuts in their budget to veterans. What? Prison security, that's another one that people don't understand. You know, these people have these scary, dangerous jobs, and and we've got a lot of them in East Metro because we've got 2 facilities in East Metro. And, you know, they don't have the funding to go out and hire people, to have enough people to do that work and be safe.
I will add though too, from the House perspective, I mean, we're trying to do things to keep the discussion going on a lot of the issues specifically that you mentioned. So just because it does seem to be happening too much that these things are just not happening in the Senate. So, you know, common sense gun violence, prevention measures like the red flag bill, the universal background checks, those are going to be part of the public safety finance bill in the House. So that will at least keep the conversation going, and hopefully the Senate conferees will have it, you know, we'll move somewhat on some of these issues. I'm sure it won't be all of them, but maybe there'll be 1 or 2. Restore the vote is in there, is in one of the other bills, is in the state government finance bill, the driver's licenses for undocumented immigrants. We passed that separately off the House floor, but I believe it's also in the transportation bill. So the discussions about these things will keep happening. It's not ideal to pass these as part of funding bills, but the alternative is to just let these issues die this year. And you know, at least on the House side, we're not prepared to do that. These issues are too important to too many people. So we're certainly gonna do everything we can to keep the discussion going and to put the maximum amount of pressure on the Senate to get some of these things done that Minnesotans want.
And I know they're a necessary evil, but I think a lot of us are frustrated about these big bloated bills again, rather than the single, you know, where we could all see that this bill is coming up and we can go and support that bill, and then that bill actually gets conversation, and then there's actually a vote, and we're all feeling like we're part of a democracy rather than all of these things hidden away in big.
Yeah, no, and
bills.
we're not in the House. We're not hiding anything. I mean, you know, just take the gun violence prevention bills do have a cost, so there is an argument to be made to put them in, and we've had committee hearings on those bills as well. So these are things that have been vetted through the House. I mean, I think when it starts to be a real problem is when you take, you know, the Omnibus Prime bill from last year. That was, you know, the length of the bill by itself is not, you know, the only indicator, but that one combined finance and policy on issues like agriculture, on transportation. I mean, just everything imaginable.
So the single subject there was the state of Minnesota.
Yeah. No, and I actually gave a hearing to a bill in the House. We have 3 caucuses now. Actually, there's a small group of Republicans who decided the Republicans weren't conservative enough, so they created their own new House Republican caucus. But one of them had a bill that actually I thought has some merit and definitely needs a discussion, and that's to tighten up the single subject rule. I actually introduced a bill. Yeah, exactly. And we heard that in the Government Operations Committee, and actually had a really good bipartisan discussion, I thought, on the issue. You know, I don't know that the language is perfect. I think, you know, it'll need, if we put something, I do feel like probably the way it needs to be done to fix that problem is through an amendment to the state constitution, because, I mean, there is a single subject provision in the state constitution right now, but the Minnesota Supreme Court has not shown a willingness to actually enforce it. You know, in Michigan, they say that the title of a bill can't be amended after the bill's been introduced. So I know that's one provision Representative Barr put into his bill, which I think maybe has some merit. So I do think there is a problem there. That's where you draw the line becomes the real question of, like, when are you defining a subject too broadly to?
So what I'm hearing is you don't feel like it's a lost cause on all of these bills yet?
I think that, you know, the way this is all going to go, like I said, it is going to be a small group of people in a room, and they're going to be making deals. And that's why, you know, people putting pressure on everybody, particularly on places where we feel it, you know, there are just things where we know,
Is it simplistic to say, without saying names, Republican senators?
yeah,
Well, yeah. Well,
definitely.
specifically too, there's a couple Republican
chairs.
senators who now have 2 House members in their district. I mean,
So Republican suburban senator.
We're aware of some.
yes, so I mean, I would think those senators in particular would be receptive,
open.
you know, are open to considering some of these, but.
So just to follow up on the omnibus thing, so all omnibuses are not equal, like what I'm hearing you guys are kind of educating. So what they're saying in the leadership, that there's many omnibuses that are okay if the issue is the same issue, but we have several different functions involved in finance and policy, that's okay as long as it's one issue. Is that what I heard?
Well, the way that I think optimally it should work is, so within the committee jurisdiction, so Health and Human Services, Education, Transportation, to do a finance omnibus for those, and even a policy omnibus where there's a lot of small policy changes, those are appropriate. Bigger issues should be standalone. You do run into an issue when there's money attached to it
Yeah.
because we're working within the
Yeah.
targets. And so sometimes it'll get in both. You know, you'll get a hearing on the floor and it'll pass off the floor
But
as a
generally
standalone.
that's okay. That's-
Generally, that's
it's
okay.
when it
It's
goes
when we,
beyond
it's
that,
when we
you
start,
throwing lemons and oranges and.
right, and well, and you're crossing too many jurisdictions and you're putting, you know, something from, transportation in an environment bill.
I mean, the way the you asked, like, is it okay if you're doing that? I mean, from a legal standpoint, the Minnesota Supreme Court has basically said anything's okay. I think they say, I mean, I'm serious, I think that the test used in Minnesota is like if 2 subjects need only be connected by a mere filament, and then that is the word that's used in some of the Supreme Court decisions. So, you know, it relates to government policy. I mean, you know, that's everything we talk about. And
I
that's-
guess I was asking.
yeah, but I mean, so there's a subjective element to it. I mean, in my mind, you know, if you are combining finance and policy in a bunch of different fields, so transportation, agriculture, jobs, labor, you know, then it's, if there's going to be a limit, that it seems to me like that has to be over the line.
So could there be like a limited number of pages? I mean, could we find some other way
Yeah,
to make
that-
them not big and bloated?
Yeah, that is hard, and I think like HHS is the one that always gets,
Mhm.
because they're always big, and that's just because there's so many separate appropriations within that, because it's such a big budget area, and there are a lot of small appropriations, so it just takes up a lot of space.
Yeah, I'd be reluctant to just impose kind of an arbitrary page limit.
I was just trying to. The filament rule doesn't really work.
No.
Scott?
You should go.
Oh, thanks. My representative and senator, I totally agree with. I love them. They're on my side philosophically, politically, every other way. Does it make sense for me to contact out-of-state people who I know are being challenging in terms of getting some policy passed? Or is that just making people mad so that they start going the other direction? Because I've heard multiple theories on that. What would you suggest?
So I think that's highly individual. Like personally, you know, when I get a bunch of emails from people that have no connection to my district, I'll look at them, but they certainly don't carry the weight that hearing from my own constituents does. You know, when I've been in a lead role on a committee, or if it's because it's an issue that's before my committee, I'll pay attention to it in that context. You know. One of the things that we've talked about is, you know, if you know people in those communities, contact them and tell them to call their elected representatives. That's the best way to do that, because we all respond to our own constituents more than anybody.
Yeah, and I mean, and even just the responsiveness to something like email, or you know, like it's all really variable. Some legislators look at, you know, I do generally look at all of the emails I receive, you know, and do pay more attention if they're from a constituent. But you know, I sort of keep track of what other people are saying too, just mentally. Like, okay, people are writing me about this. That's good to know. I don't think it hurts. But if you do have the ability to, if you do know somebody who lives in that district who shares your position and are able to get them to contact their legislator, then I think that would definitely be more effective.
Okay, thanks.
To kind of follow up on that just a smidge, so if your constituents are completely in line with them, does it help if they call you and say good job? Give you a little encouragement.
I think it does. I think to get emails, and for me, and again, this is only individual, but like I do read all my own emails, so I make a note of everything that comes across. And if I'm having to go into my leadership and advocate for something, it is really helpful to be able to say, hey, I'm hearing from da-da-da-da, you know, and make that case with real integrity that this is something that matters in my district, and that helps them make decisions about priorities.
I think so too. I mean, there's some issues also where there's, you know, I'm pretty sure there's a minority of people who feel a certain way on an issue, but they're extremely vocal about it. And a lot of legislators assume, actually the one I was thinking about is vaccines. So I work, like I've carried a pro-vaccine bill for, pro-vaccine bills of various sorts for the last 5 years. And, you know, we did a state fair survey on it. It showed there's 80% support for vaccines, but you know, most people just think like, oh yeah, vaccines are good. I got my kids vaccinated. End of story. You know, I don't need to contact my legislators to tell them vaccines are great. But the anti-vaccine people are extremely motivated. They're extremely good with social media. And so on an issue like that, I would say just hearing from people who say like, yeah, I really support your vaccine bill, like that just lets me know I'm not crazy sometimes. So, like, 'cause I think there's majority support for this, but I keep hearing from these other people. So,
So a similar question to these two then. So what would be a strategy for influencing or educating the members of the conference committees? So they are 3 from the House and 3 from the Senate. They're very unlikely to be in your district. Are they listening to their constituents at that point? Are they sort of responsible, like a chair of a committee? Are they kind of responsible to listen to the entire state?
And they'll be bigger for the omnibus bills, right?
Mhm.
They'll be 5 and 5.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
What you just said, that when you're on a conference committee, you're fair game for everybody.
Okay.
Yeah.
They will. I mean, I would say that. I mean, if you do know a constituent of theirs, though, I mean, even still, they are still elected by those people. So those are the ones they probably pay
But
extra close attention.
but if they feel like they're getting substantially more communications about one position than another, that makes it easier for them to go a certain way. And so if you're supporting the other position, make sure your voice is in the mix.
Mhm.
Okay. And so if it was a specific piece of an omnibus bill that you really, really didn't want to lose,
Right.
it's okay to focus on that.
Yeah.
This really matters to me, this really matters to my
Yeah,
family.
I mean,
Okay.
yeah, every legislator can be reached publicly, and sometimes conference committees will allow testimony too, so you can actually go to the Capitol and speak on it too.
Oh, right, that's interesting, okay. And after the State of the State, Governor Walz sort of gave laid down a marker, if you will, for One Minnesota. Let's work together. We're the only split legislature in the entire country. Let's show what bipartisanship looks like. I'm wondering if you can say anything about the effects of that inside your chambers, or if you're also seeing that it's a message that's resonated with ordinary Minnesotans, and it's the kind of thing that I could use when I call and say, look, I really care about bipartisanship. I know I'm calling a Republican about something that the Republican may be philosophically opposed to, but I'd really like you to consider it on the basis of One Minnesota. Am I just being naive at that point?
Can I start?
Yeah.
You know, I take Senator Gazelka at his word because I believe he is a person of real integrity and commitment to what he says and what he stands for. I also know there are members of his leadership group, and I'm really talking about committee chairs, not just the small leadership group, who talk a good game, hear hardly any DFL bills, of almost 300 education bills that were introduced, 13 DFL bills were heard.
That's
This session.
13 to 300 education.
Mhm. Yeah. And there are just a number of things like that where it is,
Does the pace seem slower too? I mean, I know the House, I mean, it was very striking. There would be days in the House where there were evening committees.
Right.
And the Senate would knock it off at 3 in the afternoon and.
So I'll say two things to that. One is, in the Senate, we've been known to say that, you know, it hasn't been said in the House until everybody has said it. So things do tend to go a little longer in the House just because that's just a cultural thing, and that's not to be dismissive at all. So
I got a couple good ones.
I know, the House always has more of this than the Senate does. But to that exact point, I mean, so the week before the finance bill, so not the week of the third deadline, but the week prior to that,
Okay.
E12 didn't meet at all. Right? That was sort of my reaction. Like,
Well, there's nothing to do.
right? Why should we be? We didn't have, there aren't any bills that haven't been heard, like mine or anything, you know?
Wow.
Right, and there've been a number of things like that where you're just kind of,
What would you speculate is driving that? Because surely they must have ideas they want to work on, maybe, or not.
I don't really want to, try to speculate about people's motives and what's in their head. But all I can do is assess based on what I've seen. And, chairs have an agenda and their vision of what they want to do. And this is why, in all sincerity, I wanted to talk about what I've seen in the Senate, and then because with the DFL and MAS, and I know what it was like when the DFL was in, because we've been through the same configurations. There were 2 years where the DFL was in the majority in the Senate, and the Republicans were in the majority in the House. But I know that Senator Uyghur, as chair of the Education Committee, heard a bunch of Republican bills and included a bunch of Republican bills, and it wasn't just lip service and sort of like token, minority bills. It was a legitimate effort. I was vice chair of transportation, and I sat in on those meetings where it was really clear, if you've done these things, your bill will get a hearing, and not hard things like request a hearing, have a House bill.
Start with that request.
All right.
I alluded
Companion.
to that earlier, right? I mean, based upon whether it's perception or all the conversations or whatever it is you're seeing, if they truly are, whether it's big data analytics or wherever they're getting their information, if they're concerned about losing the Senate, and it's a serious concern, and if they're responding by sticking it in everybody's eye, there's no way to convince them. You're done.
Well, I'm hearing for you, pressure, targeted, certain potentially persuadable senators is still useful.
Yes. And this session is far from over.
All right, but part of the dynamic I'm curious about, and again, this is highly simplistic, but my sense in the House is that the Speaker wants the chairs to actually do a lot of work. You've alluded to frustration by some chairs at the targets they receive. I have to believe, based on sort of what Chair Benson and Chair Abler are going through, they've got frustrations with their targets too, right? How much of that is like they won't like actually buckle down and like do work till they get what they think is a real number? I mean, is there any of that dynamic going on?
Yeah, I mean, I think clearly, everybody's going to keep their cards. They're going to hold their positions as long as they can. They're going to keep their cards close, and they're going to keep their options open as long as they can, trying to leverage as much as what they want to get at the end. And that's true for everybody on all sides. I mean, that's just negotiating.
But and I mean, you mentioned just in the House too. Like, this is my first time as a chair, and the Government Operations Committee, which I chair, a lot of bills get referred there. So basically, any bill that creates a task force, any bill that deals with rulemaking has to go there. So I mean, I've heard things that you wouldn't think of necessarily. The the net neutrality bill had some rulemaking provisions, so that had to go through there. I mean, just bills on a smorgasbord of topics. And I sort of, you know, there's this impression that like, okay, leadership, the speaker or whatever will tell you what bills they want heard. And my experience, maybe it's just because of Speaker Hortman and the way she likes to work, but she gives chairs a lot of latitude. Like the ERA, for example, like, you know, I knew people wanted it heard early, so it could get heard on the floor for Women's Day. I'm like, okay, nobody's told me, but I guess I'll just schedule a hearing on it. And it's, you know, and it's because so many bills get referred to Government Operations Committee, and so many authors of those bills want them to get heard. They want their bills to get heard. So I just tried to hear as many of them as I could, and we had some of those evening hearings. We had hearings where there were 15 bills on the agenda, and it's just, you know, it's been a really interesting experience chairing a committee for the first time. Not always in ways I expected, but oftentimes in good ways, better ways than I expected. Actually, like I've had a fair amount of autonomy as the chair. I found.
Good.
Yeah.
Hey, I had a quick question specific. I'm a retired teacher, and I know other people are interested too on where the sex education bills are, because that was the bill that had the consent, teaching about consent piece in it too. So I was wondering where they were in the House and the Senate.
It's in the education bill in the House, so I know that because I've gotten lots of emails from outside of my district telling me to have it taken out. I'd say, generally speaking, the people in my district are support that, and you know, realize like we need to.
Might be the same people that are the anti-vax.
No,
ERA,
not,
I'm just guessing.
not necessarily,
It's-
but
those are funny.
yeah, no, but I've heard from a lot of people about that, and I've heard from people in my district who support keeping it in there, and I support it as well. So, you know, that I don't know what will happen with that particular provision in the negotiations over the on the conference committee over the E12 bill. I'm sure that'll be contentious, but we'll see what happens. The Republicans will probably offer an amendment on the floor when we take it up when we get back from the break to take that provision out. I'm sure there'll be an hour or two of discussion about it in the middle of a 16-hour debate. But you know, I'm certainly hoping. I expect it'll stay in the House, but then conference committee, anybody's guess.
And it has not been heard in the Senate.
Yeah.
So, a question, the conference committees, how is it decided who's gonna be on those?
So, in the Senate, like in the case of the hands-free bill, which actually was a very bipartisan bill,
It's
but
the committee on committees or?
Nope,
No?
no.
Okay.
Typically, so like if it's a 3-member conference committee, the author, and since it was bipartisan, Jim Carlson in the Senate, DFLer, has worked on that bill for years. And so he got the DFL spot, and then another Republican got it. And that's done, basically the leaders of both caucuses confer with their key people and come up with the
Okay, but the bill authors are generally prioritized to get onto that.
Yeah.
Yeah, they'll be the lead for their chamber.
And you need to vote for a bill to be on the conference committee, right?
Yes.
Usually, in the House, there have been instances where, maybe it's just because Democrats are nicer and they want to put, at least in the House. I don't know. I'm pretty sure I've seen it where there's been, on some of these budget bills, there'll be 5 members for Democrats, 1 Republican. I mean, some of these bills I don't think are going to get any Republican votes off the House floor. But the Speaker in consultation with the bill author, in the case of the omnibus bills, it's the committee chair who's kind of the lead conferee from that chamber on there. But then often, a lot of times it's the more senior members, but not always. I know in the hands-free bill, I think Representative Newer from Minneapolis who's a freshman, was one of the conferees.
Yeah.
So.
And, sorry, I just lost my train of thought on that. I'm telling them break. No, but the conference committees, we never, you will often see on a bill that is very partisan, you may still see like one DFLer vote for it, so
Right.
they can get on the conference committee. And sometimes people get mad, why'd you vote for that bill? I say,
Right.
because I want to have a part in the outcome.
You talk about next week, the next 2 weeks before the joint targets are supposed to come out. What are people going to be seeing? Is it mostly stuff on the floor? Because most of the committees have done their work. Is that what can we expect in the next two weeks? Then there'll be the crazy last 2 weeks, right?
So I was actually going through this when I was in the office this afternoon. Like, I don't think, our committee meetings now really start going away. There will not be many committee hearings now between now and the end of session. There'll be a few things that might come up. But we will, we're in session next week, Tuesday through Thursday, officially Friday always being an open question at this time of year. And we will have session all 3 of those days and likely hear a few bills, probably not marathon sessions. But the omnibus bills are starting to be heard on the floor, and
Okay.
then we'll start with some of the smaller ones, and then some of the finance bills are still being heard in the finance committee, and then they'll come to the floor. So we are transitioning into spending a lot of time on the floor, getting the first round of omnibus bills out, which is way ahead of the game where we were a couple years ago.
Mhm.
Same in the House, where you'd be seeing.
We will, well, yeah, we're going right into some of the really big ones. I think Wednesday might be the HHS bill on the House, so we'll have marathon. I will be spending a lot of time on the House floor over the next, starting next Tuesday.
Oh, that brings up a very quirky procedural thing we've always wondered. Why is the Senate calendar like a surprise? You know what I mean? Like the House will post, here's what's going to be coming up.
Like 2-3 days in advance, because it knows in the House.
And
The
here
Senate, you
are
like have
here
to
are the
stop it.
pre-filed amendments, and then the Senate is like, ooh, what's gonna happen now? Like, what's the history of that?
Well, you guys passed that rule right after we got elected.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's a relatively new rule in the House to have
Yeah.
24-hour notice on amendments.
Yeah, you mentioned the amendments. That is a more recent phenomenon. So in
Okay.
2013, we put into effect a new rule saying that any amendment to any bill on the floor has to be posted 24 hours in advance. A lot of committees use that as well, and that was very controversial. The Republicans at the time claimed we were just trying to muzzle the minority, stifle them,
And then
when
they liked it,
And then
right?
when they took charge, they kept it. So it seems to be here to stay in the House. I mean, occasionally something weird happens where the rules get suspended, and then it's a free for all on amendments. That's happened a couple times since then, but it's basically been like that since I've been there. I can't even imagine just what it would be like to just be able to think of an amendment on the fly and have the revisor draft it and submit
Every
it.
single thing seems to be a special order, where if you look up special orders, that's supposed to be special, and at end of session, we have to emergency move this thing, and instead, the entire time, everything's a special order. You get like no notice on those.
Yeah.
Like, when
What's
did that
the
start?
history
Like,
or what's-
That I can't actually tell you because that's pretty long standing,
Huh.
I think, from what I understand.
It's the
And
way
that-
we've always done it.
We get a little
It's
of that.
frustrating.
Yes. Well,
It's very
tell me about it. I said, we don't know either, so makes it a little challenging. And honestly, I think there's a trade-off there. Not so much the special orders. I think we should be more transparent about what bills are coming up with more notice. But in terms of the amendments, because sometimes you do have an idea for an amendment on the fly,
Right.
You get into the debate on the floor, and you're like, and if you haven't heard this bill in committee, and maybe it is something you have some knowledge about as an issue, it's like, wait a minute, we should do whatever, and in terms of being in the minority, element of surprise, not a bad deal sometimes, I mean, they call the shots on so many different things, and to have that opportunity to say, okay, how do you like this one? Then that has worked both ways.
Yeah, for me, it's more knowing the bills as
Yes.
opposed to the amendments is an important thing that we never get any.
Yeah,
notice. Sometimes it's 90 minutes.
And I don't, I'm not exactly sure what goes on with that in terms of why that is the way it is, but from what I've seen, even when we get a list of what's going to be on special orders the next day, sometimes things fall off, and it's because negotiations are still going on. So a lot of it is just the sausage making. I agree though, we should have that out.
So I want to be respectful of your guys' commitment. Let's take one last question, and then I don't know if you guys can stick around, but
On the planet.
go ahead.
Well, it's probably a lot of good questions. I was going to ask about the health and human services. I don't want to say scandals, but like the issues that have come around.
Around
See-
CCAP.
Childcare.
Yeah, that whole thing.
Yeah.
What your thoughts are on that? And the budget is for health and human services so
Right.
large. It's seems to take up a lot of energy from Republicans, kind of, why don't they get this in order? Even the governor mentioned that things weren't quite right there. So
Right.
I'm wondering
Right, clearly.
what your thoughts are on that.
So I actually, because I do these things on break, I've been reading the legislative auditor's report on CCAP. And, you know, we need to make sure we're doing what we can to, and because it's a combination of both fraud, which is more intentional, but also just errors, you know, I mean, and is the information being gathered accurately? And so it's important that we do it, but it is also important to realize that, you know, this is a federal program with a state implementation that actually gets handled across 87 different counties. And there are a lot of transactions, and there's just a lot of margin for error. And so it's not as simple as just saying, do better. You know, and I will say, I think the legislative program makes some really good specific recommendations on things that can be done better. But, you know, when I read that, it looks like a lot of manpower to me, you know, at the county level and at the state level to babysit these things more carefully and thoroughly, which should be done. But that, you know, you can't just wave a magic wand and make that happen. So, you know, people need to be prepared to have a serious conversation about what it will take.
Yeah, and the rhetoric, I mean, particularly from the GOP, is just, you know, there was this Fox News or this news report that said maybe some of the funds are going towards terrorism, but there was no proof of that, and the, you know, in the
Correct.
okay, yeah, and the auditor, you know, there was no evidence that it was, but they, you know,
And
but he might have
really
said like,
numbers.
there's no way to prove that it's not, and so they're like, this is being, you know, just any. I mean, we see it going on from the national level, and they're just kind of, this is the frame that's helpful to them at this particular political moment, is to shout out things about terrorism. So, you know, it's a lot of work to do, as Senator Kent said, and you kind of need to get past that unhelpful rhetoric on issues like this.
Yeah, and then what did you think about losing Tony Laurie to going to? Because we're sad to see him go and then lose
Yeah.
that district.
I know, and so I just think the world of Tony Laurie, and I've enjoyed working with him, and I miss seeing him all the time, personally. And he, you know, we talk about, you know, within the legislature, and we can't all know everything. I always refer to it as a team sport, you know, and after a while you get to know, okay, I really like the way this person thinks about this issue, and they're on those committees, that's who I'm gonna turn to and get insight on. Tony was one of those people that was just so knowledgeable, such a leading voice. And obviously, you know, we're disappointed to lose that seat.
Yeah.
But you know, he'll be great in human services.
All right, any last words for us? Anything else you want to share?
I would just say, you know, thank you all for being engaged and for being here, and you know, it's going to be a wild and interesting final 4 weeks, and stay tuned.
All right.
Stay
Stay tuned.
engaged.
Last prediction from you guys. Are we looking at a special session or not?
I don't think so.
I don't either.
All right.
Yeah, much the way that when a friend gets pregnant and you're like, I think you're having a boy, you know? Not that it's based on anything. I just kind of feel like.
So if you want to plan a vacation for end of May, early June might be.
I mean, I don't know that I'd bet money on this or anything, but
Maybe not
I just
non-refundable
don't-
European tickets.
Gotcha.
So many legislators don't want that to happen.
Yes.
Including legislators in leadership. So
Yes.
that's
In
always
both parties, because that's the thing. I mean, and I think this is a little substantive. Historically, you know, shutdowns, that kind of stuff, Republicans tend to get blamed more than Democrats. And, you know, I can see where they ultimately will think that's not in their best interest to be seen as the obstructionists on this. But that's just speculating.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.